right, well, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're having a great Ashoka U Exchange experience so far. We appreciate you coming to this session. We know you have lots and lots of choices. So we'll just do some brief introductions. So I'm Valerie Warpatinsky. I'm the Associate Director for Entrepreneurial Education in the Origin Ventures Academy for Entrepreneurial Leadership in Geese College of Business at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That is a mouthful. I've been in the social innovation space for a long time, and the university community engagement space, working in social justice issues, caring a lot about DEI issues. I certainly am not an expert. My goal here is to help you engage in the struggle that I'm that I'm constantly trying to learn, and hopefully we'll all get a little bit better with creating better settings in the places where we're working. And so I do want to read our our land acknowledgement grant. So the University of Illinois is a land grant institution. We're in central Illinois, 2.5 hours south of Chicago. And I just want to recognize and acknowledge that the University of Illinois resides on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We're also obliged to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is merely a start, and as we move forward in the next 150 years. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lorena.
Thank you, Valerie. My name is Lorena Garcia Duran. I have recently launched the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts inside of the organization, inside of Ashoka. Ashoka is a global organization. We have presence in more than 80 countries. I've been with the organization for 13 years, and I can tell a little bit more of how we were able to launch this initiative with formality, but the reality is that the core of the organization has always been interconnected with diversity, equity, inclusion, just never really named it. And I think that's very important to name. I have never done a land acknowledgement on myself. And when I thought about doing it on behalf of Ashoka, because of its global context, I decided to scratch that and make it a little bit more intimate and personal. I live right now in the city of Los Angeles, and particularly in the area where I am, I stand on the land of Chumash, Tongva, and Fernandeño Tatavian communities. And of course, unfortunately, the Chumash, for example, just lost in 1965 the last person that spoke the tribe's language. And there has been some efforts to recover the language, but it hasn't necessarily ever come back. I also want to recognize that as a Mexican, as a mestizo Mexican, I'm embarrassed that the piece the piece of myself that is indigenous, I haven't been able to really figure out inside of my family, what is that indigenous blood? What are the tribes? What are my ancestors on that side of the family? And impressively, and actually not surprisingly, very easy for me to find the other side of the family, the European, the Iranian, all of those pieces. I was able to track them down, but I cannot find my tribal ancestry, which is actually more than 50% of who I am. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that it's not only land that was taken away, it was culture, it was knowledge, it was philosophy that has, in some places completely lost. So yeah, just want to acknowledge that and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Lorena and Valerie.
You're on mute, Michelle.
Oh, sorry.
You're on mute again.
Hello, is it working? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Valerie and Lorena. I just want to quickly read the privacy statement. Welcome to the Ashoka U Exchange. Ashoka is hosting this event and we will be recording it. We may also use clips, images, recordings, quotes, and other parts of the recording in Ashoka publication and share via social media. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your camera and ask questions via the chat window. We will post additional information about the recording and consents in the chat box. If you have any concerns, please feel free to send me a message directly or email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I just wanted to make a quick comment connected to logistics. If you just joined, and please make sure that you're on mute, so we don't have to go through the list and mute you if you're not speaking, because of course we're going to have a lot of little moments where we will invite you to speak. So let's kick us off with some outcomes, some goals that we're trying to achieve with the session. So number one is understand the value of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, not only to enhance social innovation processes and outcomes, but also to see what is the connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion and the entrepreneurship ecosystems that the academia and the higher education world is offering and engaging. Also apply systems thinking tools to analyze problems related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are multiple, in campus-based change-making and entrepreneurship ecosystems. And number three is reflect on levers for change for creating more diverse, equitable, and inclusive change-making ecosystems. I think that this one is probably the most yummy one, because it's connected, it's individual, and we're going to try to get to the point where it's personal and we can start identifying how that is connected. I would like to share a little bit of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means for Ashoka, what we have been doing around this, and how do we see the interconnection of diversity, equity, and inclusion with change making. Probably one of the most important pieces of the puzzle is that when you are in an organization that is trying to create a world that works for everyone, a world where there are more problem solvers than problems, a world where everyone and anyone has the capacity and the tools and the skills and the environment to see a problem, to see an injustice and act upon it. When you understand that that's the goal of the organization that you're part of, or that you're engaged with, or that you're trying to emulate, when you talk about how diversity is playing a role in the decisions, how inclusive are you when you build that diversity, and more importantly, how are all of your processes always being questioned if they are equitable or not. That is one of the most difficult things that, quite honestly, is far bigger than Ashoka. It's about this whole system of doing good in the world. I just heard this morning that, philanthropy or the doing good business would not necessarily be that happy if we had an equitable world, because they would run out of business, right? And there is a lot of complexity around that. Right? If we build a world where everyone is a change maker, if we build a world where everything is working and we are all mutually helping each other, and we're overcoming all of the social and environmental problems, then we don't need philanthropy. We don't need anyone to come and help, right? I feel that there's going to be an evolution there if we do a good job, only if we do a good job. And so eventually you don't need anyone to come and help. You need people to come and be accomplices. You need people to come and participate and co-create together in that change. And that's a very different mentality. And I think that that's where we're going to get through in this session. How do we help young people who are starting to think about, oh, I want to do good, I want to change the world, I want to participate in systemic change, I want to participate in getting rid of injustice, et cetera, et cetera. How can you do that without being paternalistic? how can you do that without, with a profound and proactive thinking and consideration towards diversity, equity, and inclusion? And when it comes to Ashoka, I think that that's our biggest responsibility. And there's a complete and absolute interaction between what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like and building an everyone a changemaker world. So almost every single time that you see Ashoka's work, I encourage us to question if that is actually building a better world, or if that is perpetuating the same systems that creates most of the problems. So it's a little bit complex. We'll get into it. We'll dismantle pieces by pieces, and we totally encourage a conversation around this. And you'll see we'll have some prompts and some good conversations around this. But I think that's a little bit of the framework that I wanted to share, Valerie.
Great, thank you. So I just want to mention something before we go into a couple of writing prompts. And so I kind of mentioned I've been in the social innovation space for a long time, university community engagement, sort of trying to tackle those tensions with that work, trying to do it better. And we're going to be talking about on a few different levels. So we have, we're sort of thinking about Lorena's work with the Ashoka organization. Then we're sort of thinking about, and so if you look at that blue sort of circle, thinking about community change making ecosystems broadly, in the world, right? And then you're thinking about the Ashoka U initiative, and that's sort of this orange space of kind of thinking about university-based change making ecosystem and this proliferation of Ashoka U Changemaker Campuses, and the good work that's gone on over the last decade or so with that proliferation of campuses. And then we have the space, the green space, which was thinking about university-based entrepreneurship ecosystems, or entrepreneurship and social innovation ecosystems. And this is also kind of a trend that's been getting more and more prioritization and funding on campuses, partly in response to university missions related to economic development, also in part dealing with responses, I think, to economic challenges of institutions and decreases of state funding and things for public institutions. So there are a lot of drivers in that space. And so in the last 3 years or so, I've been more centered in the green space, but having a passion and really a focus on inclusive entrepreneurship initiatives and social innovation and social entrepreneurship within what we would call our entrepreneurship ecosystem. And so there's going to be some overlap with the broader change-making ecosystem. On our camp, we are not, University of Illinois is not a change-maker campus. We sort of didn't make it in under the wire, to be part of that movement, unfortunately. If those of you who are on the platform are associated with Ashoka U Changemaker Campuses, it would be great to kind of hear some of your thoughts, because we realize that the culture of those institutions is going to look very different and might be very just more salient to students, community members, faculty, in terms of, hey, what is change making, and that's part of our institutional identity. And so I'm just kind of laying that stage to sort of think about where do these tensions overlap. When I talk later about systems thinking and stuff, I'm really going to be focused on this entrepreneurship ecosystem, but related to social innovation within that. But certainly when we go through, if you're not involved in that kind of movement, you could think about your change making ecosystem on your campus, or if you're not part of a campus institution, you could be thinking about the change making or entrepreneurship ecosystem in a community or a region that you might be part of. And so Learner's going to take we're going to go through 2 different prompts that kind of get you thinking a little bit about change making ecosystems and entrepreneurship ecosystems. So you'll do like a quick write, and then we'll ask a few of you share your brave souls to put your video on or your audio and just share a few ideas, and then we'll move on.
Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, basically what the prompt is not necessarily, we don't necessarily want the best examples that you come up with. Anything that comes to your mind, it would be super valuable. And let's just start kicking, a little bit, our minds around this. So how well are university-based change-making ecosystems advancing diversity, equity, inclusion to support the everyone a change maker vision? So we encourage you to start writing some ideas on the chat. Go ahead, anything is valuable, everything works. And then maybe we can choose some people from the audience to share around. Everyone, and I'm welcome to answer, I'm okay with answering in case some people might have any questions about what the Everyone a Changemaker vision is. But just in a very broad sense, it's just the concept of everyone can and should play a role in figuring out how do we solve the problems that we are living in, right? So it's not a distant situation. It's as proximate as possible, the problem, right? And so how do we all participate from our own perspectives? It doesn't even have to be that I am capacitated to address a problem. Anyone and everyone can participate in a solution. So I don't know. I hope that helps clarify a little bit. So I'm not seeing anyone make any comments. Don't be shy. Anything and every kind of idea is welcome. There you go. Thank you, Ali. Where gaps have been bigger, we need to extend further. Absolutely. What else comes to mind? And Valerie, please feel free to jump with sub ideas.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is like, so folks, with some of the quick writes, so if you put in the chat, that's great to share ideas, but you can also just make notes to yourself, and then if you need a little more time, we can wait, a few seconds, and then we'd ask for a few people to take their mute off and just share a couple of ideas, and then we'll move on. But we do want to try to get a little bit of participation. I have many thoughts about some of these prompts, but I want to try to have the discipline of not putting that baggage out there. Partly because we really want you to be thinking about using some of these critical frames for looking at your own systems and not being too influenced. At least I don't want you to be too influenced by how I'm thinking about my own ecosystem.
I would even encourage any brave person in our group, if they even have, besides judging it, if they even have an example of how change-making ecosystems are looking like in their own university. So maybe we can also kick some of that, like some examples where you've seen, let's not judge them if they're good or well or advanced or not advanced, if they're necessarily doing a great job with diversity, equity, inclusion, but just some examples, of how this change-making ecosystems are looking in your own campuses and universities.
And you don't have to be an Ashoka Changemaker campus, by the way. So hopefully that wasn't restrictive. No volunteers.
Volunteers.
The best laid plans. We put it on the Zoom link so you actually could talk. Maybe they've gotten used to be more passive or just in the chat.
Do you want to share one, Valerie? Do you want to share an example? Let's not judge it. Do you want to share an example of a changemaker ecosystem, or do you want to take us somewhere else?
I'd rather just move on. Like, I can give examples more with the systems, but I think one of the things to keep in mind. So the first time I talked to Lorena, I think we talked for, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours or something. We really. It was interesting because when we go back to the Venn diagram on the other slide, is I really had a lot of things on my mind in terms of how, I guess, some of the gaps and frustrations with my own experiences in terms of looking at entrepreneurship ecosystems on campus and really being passionate about social venture development and trying to get more people involved in activism and a variety of things. And like I said, I've been in sort of this kind of engagement work for a long time. And then I was very disrupted with my thoughts with Lorena in a good way, because we were sort of then trying to figure out, well, where does Ashoka, come down on some of these movements with social entrepreneurship and these entrepreneurship ecosystems on campuses. And you know, how are people understanding this broader frame of change making versus social innovation versus social entrepreneurship? And it was a really, again, challenging and exciting and interesting conversation. We worked through it through a storm on Lorena's end, and we had to like change platforms and things because she lost connectivity. But it's a really, you know, I think we're at another inflection point. And wherever you're based, especially if you're working for a university, you know, campus institution, in sort of how understanding how some of these things are playing out and some of the tensions and figuring out what are the leverage points to try to create value. And there aren't any easy answers at all. And I think sometimes language gets in the way. And some of the typical trappings of universities and ownership and, you know, decentralized systems and siloed disciplines and all those things can get in the way a little bit. And so I think the idea behind this first prompt is really sort of figuring out, one, we just want you starting to reflect on your own settings and how well do you think they're activating change agency, you know, in the broadest perspective, you know, and what Ashoka would maybe be interested in. And it looks like we had a couple comments in the chat. I don't know if there's anything we want to bring up. Again, some of this is just we're going to introduce you to some of these prompts and some of these tools, and try to get you thinking about it, and hopefully you'll have some action items after. So here's maybe the second prompt, and maybe just Lorena, just have them think about it for a minute, and then if people want to add a comment or two in the chat, or if we have somebody who's willing to share out on this one, that would be great.
Awesome. I'm getting a little bit of echo. Are you too, or is just my? No, we're good. Okay. Yeah. So with this other prompt, I think is starts to encourage us to go in a little bit deeper, and probably even a little bit more difficult, right? But how are these? You call it entrepreneurship ecosystems, maybe because I'm not in the academia world. To me, it translates as just efforts, right? Efforts that we are encouraging students to and academia to start working upon. And so, you know, how are they really engaging communities that have been historically most marginalized? And we're not just talking about Indigenous people or Black and Brown people, but also, you know, all of the different identities that tend to be in this system of advantage, who tend to be less advantaged, right? And not because they are less advantaged, but the system itself is disadvantaged, right? So, and all of the intersectionalities between it. So when you are designing, you know, how any of this entrepreneurship ecosystems are going to implement and start addressing some of the issues, let's say just in the surroundings of a campus, how much of the design, of the pre-thinking before anything is put in place, actually engages directly the people that are going to benefit from that effort? How much is it proactively and not an afterthought? And so some ideas, some works, I kind of quickly went through some of the things that you guys are sharing in the chat, and there's some great examples. So I really encourage you to unmute and share some of these, because I think that they're on spot with some of the things that we want to highlight. So I don't know if Radovan, you feel comfortable in sharing, for example. I don't want to call you out if you don't want to share, but it's very interesting, some of the pieces that you're sharing here.
Hola, hello.
Hola.
Well, I'm from Mexico, from UPAEP. We're a Changemaker campus. And well, just wanted to share that like some years ago, there was this funding for collaboration projects with for Changemaker campuses. And we got together, you know, thinking about how can we come up with a definition on how Changemaker looks through the lenses of equity and inclusion. And we got together in Mexico, in Puebla, some Becky from Tulane and Danica from Western Washington came down, and we worked for a week in, like trying to figure out what did we understand as equity and inclusion, how did we feel about it, and from our own universities and our own university missions and stuff. And it was a very interesting process that we had a lot of conversations, a lot of working and thinking and going back and forth. And we came up with this with this definition that we shared at the exchange in San Diego. That is, I like it more in Spanish because it sounds more good to me, but is this person who drives just change and not just change, but just change, that are conscious of self, able to be part and feel part of with others, and are willing to question and challenge with a sense of freedom. And it's a process that we started, and that we feel that these conversations have to be happening in many spaces, in many areas, because probably at the beginning we don't all understand the same level what equity and inclusion is for the different contexts that we live in, so that's what we had, and it was a great experience to build this concept and to share with the network.
Radhavan, that's fun. Thank you so much, not only for being brave and being the one that breaks the silence, but also, you touched something very important. I don't think anybody has one definition, and not one definition should apply everywhere. But the fact that you are talking about it, the fact that you're open a conversation about it, it's the whole point. Nobody, not even Ashoka, 40-year organization doing, nobody has the one answer. And so I really congratulate that you guys are dealing with this and are bringing this to the top of the mind, because I think, and I don't know I would love your thoughts around this. We don't want to see change become unjust change, or we don't want to continue to see that social change continues to perpetuate the problems that we are claiming to be supporting, to be solved. And I don't know if you want to share a little bit more of the complexity of that, right? How do you engage students in coming up with solutions and not get distracted by this, the savior mentality, but actually to always question, right? Am I really doing good? So I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that dilemma, right?
Well, we have a couple of programs at UPAEP in Mexico where they're like scholarships for students that, as part of that scholarship, have to develop and work social impact projects throughout their college life. Some of these students come from rural or indigenous communities. They get a full scholarship, and it's very interesting how they come up with these solutions. First, like now I'm a university student, and I think I know my community, and I think I know my people. But when they go back, the learning process of you don't know that well your community, you don't know that well what's going on in your community, even though you are part of it, becomes very interesting. And we also try to use some system thinkings and approaches, and this tool that Daniela Papi Thornton developed on the Impact Gap campus, in order for them to understand deeply that the problem is not what they think it is, but to go deep into the understanding all the things going on and all the forces that are in tension in the problem, so they can come up with a just solution and with these lenses of equity and inclusion.
Thank you, Radovan. Susan, would you feel comfortable in sharing with the group what you just shared in the chat? I see you are unmuted. So if you don't feel comfortable, don't worry, mute yourself back. But if you do, please share.
We've got a couple of other great comments, examples from Ellie and Heather's added something. So I'd encourage us to maybe, yeah, let's move on, but maybe folks can continue to add examples in the chat. So there, I appreciate that people are giving really good like examples from their institution and some more progressive things. So keep these things in mind. People can keep adding, but we're gonna shimmy on into thinking about some of the systems thinking, then we'll try to make up some time so we have enough time at the end to try to dig into the stuff a little bit more. Hopefully you'll be warmed up.
Sorry, Valerie, I think Susan is back.
Okay.
And she would like to share. Susan, you ready? Uh-oh. It's okay. It's okay, Susan. I think it's not working. We can't hear you. But do interrupt us whenever you're back and ready. Sorry, Valerie. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, that's good. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to sort of mention is to start thinking about systems thinking is that, at least in my experience, some of the current mindsets that I've been observing around the DEI problem, you know, so to speak, is really a deficit approach. So people are kind of thinking like, hey, we need to increase our numbers, as an example, women and people of color and other, you know, groups in our programs. And sometimes that's genuine, and sometimes that is also being driven by other observations and pressures to be responsive because programs aren't, and people are recognizing that, but there'll be some push, right? And so one of the things that I've noticed in many of these conversations is this pattern of first order versus second order change. And there's this dominant focus on first order change. People will be like, well, how do you know that you're making a difference? And they just talk about numbers. So it's like, if we just have, and no, that's important. Don't get me wrong. You know, the fact that there's only 10% women represented in entrepreneurship lectures on our campus over the last 20 years, you know, yeah, increasing those numbers would be important. Our mentors, our judges who are engaging with our students, the students in our programs, all those are really significant. But what this sort of focus on the individual does is it's sort of a less holistic approach to sort of understanding how to create lasting change. So sometimes these are temporary changes, short term. They may get a bump in those numbers and participation. We also don't know like when those numbers are reported because things change. So it's like you know people are reporting like, hey, we have this percentage, you know, of diversity in our programs, but then we don't see what the attrition is, you know, and we certainly don't know what those experiences are and what damage might be happening, you know, to people who are engaging in these environments, and what the messaging is. Like, we're not really learning, you know, much about that. And so sometimes the focus, like I said, is on recruitment, you know, getting more people engaged. Sometimes it's about like a compensatory model where it's sort of thinking like, all right, well, you know, people aren't confident, so let's build their confidence, or people don't have those introductory skills, so let's like do some skill building and some knowledge, you know, awareness. And those things are fine, but it's not particularly strengths based, and sort of thinking about, again, from a systems level, what are some other things that we can do to think about how people can, where there's sort of a person and environment fit. And it's not always about changing people, or finding more of them and just putting them into the same, sometimes toxic, dysfunctional systems that are working maybe very well for some people, but not well for others. You know, you're either going to lose, like I said, we can't guarantee positive outcomes from that, right? So we need to be looking a little bit deeper. And so, and I don't know, people can put in the chat too, if, you know, what your experiences are when people are talking about DEI issues on your campuses, and especially where it's interfacing with social innovation or change-making discussions or entrepreneurship ecosystems. But this is about as far as I hear people getting. And in many cases, they're not even working on the numbers. It's sort of a denial, you know, like, well, they're, you know, I'll question these different environments, like, what, we don't have, you know, we don't have these speakers, we don't have these, they're like, oh, you know, saying there's nobody, you know, so this sort of justification that it's a pipeline, you know, problem, which I would challenge, you know, until my dying breath. But it's kind of shocking, like how easy it is to deflect, even just with, you know, just on the numbers, much less sort of digging deeper. So one of the things I wanted to sort of, that I've been thinking about certainly, and I want to encourage others to do, and somebody had kind of mentioned already, this systems thinking model. This has been on my mind the last few years. I was working in this, using that sort of approach before, but you know, a few years ago, I actually got more invested in it from an Ashoka U Exchange conference, interestingly, when people were talking about different ways of doing pitch competitions. And then I got introduced to Oxford School Center's, you know, Map the System Challenge, and got some of my students participating in that. And so it's really been on my mind of thinking about this as an approach to help build skills for social innovation, but also as a lens that can be used for ecosystem builders to think about advancing DEI issues and improving the quality of these contexts in which we're working. And so by taking a systems approach as a way of gaining clarity and making sense of some of that complexity, it's an opportunity to actually engage stakeholders, including those unheard voices that they're not being asked or engaged in the system. And then if you're using some of these tools, eventually identifying some levers of change in order to develop a strategy for making hopefully more changes. And so in this case, I want you to be thinking about, you know, so if you have this sort of goal, so in this case, just sort of putting this guiding star of like, hey, if I want to create a better, more just world through entrepreneurship and change-making education, and if that's sort of what I'm going for, sort of think about this prompt. So how might we create an inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem, again, sort of university-based, that supports transformational learning, economic development, and social impact? So these are some things that I'm, you know, so the prompt that I'm using to look at, you know, my own context. So I'm going to run through just, again, really high level, quick introduction to some of the tools if you're not familiar with them. These are not my tools. These are things that other people have worked on for a long time and perfected. I've put some of the sources here, but I'm going to just take you through a few of them and hopefully get you thinking about, again, within your context, if you're trying to create a more just, inclusive, equitable ecosystem, whether that's a change-making ecosystem or an entrepreneurship and social innovation ecosystem or an ecosystem in the community. How can you evaluate that system in order to figure out places where your action has a better chance of sticking and sort of making some lasting, more just change? And so these are just the order of some of the things that we'll go through. Go ahead.
Vali, I just wanted to ask you if now is a good time to bring Susan's example, or should we wait until you go through these? Because I think her audio system now works. Totally up to you. Now or a little bit later.
I mean, she can go now. I mean, yeah, I don't know if her audio will work later. So let's sneak that comment in now if she's ready, and then we'll go over the tools.
I don't want to interrupt y'all though.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
I apologize. I have lots of programs running in the background that have to keep running so students can do their work. It messes with my technology. So in talking about inclusive practices that are going well on campus, one of the projects that I think I'm most proud of and impressed with and often in awe of is one of our faculty members who teaches in our Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies program. Came to us after creating a program in New York City, the Trans Oral History Project. And when he came to rural Iowa, he recognized that our trans community, especially in rural settings, is incredibly isolated and has a unique story to tell. And so he teaches a class, an oral history class that is using community-based participatory research. And in my experience, that's more often used in the STEM fields or in public health, not as often in the humanities or humanistic social studies. And so he's engaging rural trans folk as well as his students in gathering these oral histories that then can be used for policy change, advocacy, and systems change. And so he's teaching his students inclusively, all of the students, how to do that. And I think it's a radical form of inclusivity that is a model that I would like to see used in other spaces on our campus, at least.
Cool, great. It's Lorena. Did you want to provide feedback on that or no?
I just learned that that session might have been recorded, and I think Michelle will share around if anyone is interested. That really sounds fascinating, Susan. Thank you so much for sharing.
I didn't talk about that in the session that we did. That was a whole nother conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion and dominant epistemologies and community stories. But if you're interested in more about this project, please let me know and I can get you information.
I would, raising my hand if you can share.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely interested,
Okay.
for sure. And so, no, thank you for sharing that. And so, yeah, these links and these slides will be uploaded, so people don't have to worry about that. Especially as we kind of go through them, because we're going to go. Probably won't have as much time as I was hoping for some little mini quick writes in between. But I want to just introduce a few things, and then hopefully we can save that time for discussion. But so the links that I put on the slide, like all the stuff that I'm showing you right now, these frameworks, they have like step-by-step instructions. They have the graphics, they have examples, the social change innovators platform. I had that link here. Debbie Brock and others have put lots of great resources there. So I definitely recommend you sort of checking out that site. And again, these manuals and things are there. So it'll be ready for you if you get intrigued enough. The session is really to just kind of get you thinking, and then knowing where you can go for those resources to unpack it. So a few things I just want to kind of click through. The first is sort of thinking about stakeholder ecosystem maps and the 5 Rs framework. And so when I work with a lot of student startups, a lot of social ventures. And so one of the first things that we usually are having them do is create a stakeholder map and sort of thinking about the context of the market in which they're working before they're involved, and then maybe one after, and kind of thinking about where did they interface, in that system. And so the 5 Rs network is just a little extension of that. So one of the first steps I would encourage folks to do if you're interested in using systems thinking to analyze your ecosystem is just doing a really quick and dirty drawing, like sort of concept map drawing of your ecosystem map. So think about who are the main players, the main entities. When we think about entrepreneurship, we're looking at value change and exchanges of information and money and programs and resources. So in your case, you could be thinking about some of those things, but also, what are the relationships between these different roles and these different entities? And so when you extend it in terms of the 5 Rs, we might also think about this as a bounded system. And so what resources are flowing into the system? What are the rules that are, and sort of policies, implicit and explicit, that are ruling the system? Thinking about role relationships and power relationships within roles, and also thinking what are the results of the outcomes that come out of those environments. So this is a way of kind of just starting to map the players and the relationships and kind of what's happening. And then you might think about your role as a participant observer in the ecosystem. So I've been doing this a lot over the last few years, participating and certainly having a role, but also observing and talking to people a lot and making notes and just making key behavioral observations related to DEI and the effectiveness of ecosystems to engage social innovation processes and outcomes. And so this is just like a really easy way of sort of thinking about, you know, I kind of mentioned before, numbers can be tricky, right? So do you, start off where you have lots of women and people of color in a program, let's say, but then it drops off, after several weeks, or not just dropping out of a program, but looking at attrition, but actually looking at the type of participation. So you can map, sort of different demographic groups. So, I think of a program that I was part of, and the very different behaviors of the young men that were involved and the young women who were involved in interfacing with these entrepreneurs and these meetings, and again, who was talking and who was not talking, and how that dynamic changed over the course of several days. And then there's also this idea of thinking about critical incidents. So, will something change or undulate based off of critical incidents or interventions? And so again, kind of thinking about a particular group and mapping behavior over time, or thinking about two groups that you're sort of differentiating between and kind of putting those maps, superimposing those maps on top of each other. It can give you, again, just by doing these very simple drawings, it can help you capture something that's maybe it was in the back of your mind, but you didn't make it explicit, right? Or if you're just writing, observations, it's not the same as trying to actually put that in a visual, and then you can see things like really obvious, and it can give you some ideas for kind of digging in. The Iceberg model is sort of the next stage of sort of thinking about, like, well, you have these events or these behavioral observations and things that might be happening, but what's going on under the surface. So in this case, starting to capture patterns and trends so that you can anticipate them, thinking about what are the underlying structures and things that are influencing these patterns over time, and thinking about how might I design or create interventions or new programs that alter those structures, those underlying structures. And then thinking about mental models and how we might, transform some of those attitudes or mental models that are holding us back. And so in the entrepreneurship space, again, this might be anything from looking at differences in active participation versus just being involved at all, like I'm enrolled but I'm not participating, to mentors, judges, professionals who are engaging with those students. What's the content of the curriculum and the programs? When you're thinking about underlying structures, it might be things like, what are the application processes or enrollment restrictions based off of your major, the process for sourcing teams, role and power relationships, who's making decisions, what's the nature of the curriculum and the program structure, what's the approach, tone, or vehicles and the marketing strategy, who are they trying to reach and what's the message? And how does that play into stereotypes or misperceptions about what an entrepreneur is, or what a social entrepreneur is, or a social innovator? Funding structures and dependencies, like, are we thinking about reliance on donors or VC investable ventures, and hoping that then that will lead to other contributions to the campus programming. Thinking about competing priorities of colleges and departments versus central administration, and competing priorities with advancement officers and technology management, and trying to commercialize and get some of a piece of the IP from ventures. And then thinking about metrics, and like, what metrics are universities going for, and how do things like Princeton Review and and other rating systems in terms of entrepreneurship influence in positive and negative ways, whether or not those systems support change makers broadly speaking, but social entrepreneurs or people who are pursuing social businesses or social enterprises. And then think about mental models, and this plays out a lot. Like, if you ask people to, what's their idea of an entrepreneur, many women and BIPOC students being reluctant to use that mantle, or feel like, oh, that's somebody else, or that's, or feeling discouraged that if they're not a tech-enabled venture capital investable, fast growth venture, that they aren't worthy of attention or access to the mentor office hours, or that that the demo days aren't really there for them, or just sort of thinking about competing for time and attention and opportunity. And then thinking about, just some of the idea behind meritocracy and the startup grind and the stories that mentors might share that often are about, this, I'm doing everything for this venture, and essentially all the other people in that person's list are holding down the, holding things down. So it's like they're taking care of the family, or they're taking care of their neighbors, or doing other civic engagement, responsibilities. And so the sort of unilateral, monolithic representations of like what an entrepreneur is and how that gets, codified, for students who might be in those settings. So these are just, again, some of the things that might play out in thinking about structures and mental models and where you might be able to intervene. And then there's a few things that, again, I'll just sort of click through quickly so you have an idea, but you'll have this as a resource, and it takes you through it in the manuals. But thinking about what are the forces that are keeping your system, in this case, thinking about an entrepreneurship ecosystem or change-making ecosystem at its current state. And so however you've evaluated that state with those first prompts that we did at the beginning of the session, like how well or how effective are they at supporting DEI and supporting social innovation and supporting diverse entrepreneurs, right? So there's some state that you're evaluating and sort of thinking about, what are the people, the trends, events, norms, phenomena, institutions, policies, and things that are keeping that status quo, in your ecosystem. And so they're going to be enablers, so things that are going to support or increase the effectiveness of that system in terms of DEI and support of social innovation and diverse entrepreneurs. And there are going to be things that inhibit or undermine that more just ecosystem or system. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do, again, on your own, is sort of thinking about if you were to take inventory of some of those things. So first you kind of do a little bit of that mapping, start thinking about underlying things in your iceberg, model, and then, maybe just taking some sticky notes and stuff and thinking about, okay, here's my ecosystem. What are enablers and inhibitors in terms of creating a more just setting? And then you're going to take that and kind of build on that analysis. And so one idea is sort of looking at this structural, attitudinal, and transactional analysis. And this is kind of similar, has some similar ideas to the iceberg, model. So here I have some explanations of sort of each of those structures. But again, you're sort of thinking, as we might think about even an environmental ecosystem, right? And sort of, so what's the structure, the structural environment, both the built environment and the natural environment. But also, what is the infrastructure that's at play that's keeping these systems in place in terms of policies and practices and the power of certain players in that organization. A lot of the attitudinal thing can be, that's where those mental models can map onto that. So thinking about those norms or beliefs or implicit understandings, and whether it's perceived or reality. And we know that that's not a simple, distinction, but like, how are those attitudinal things impacting the environment as well as individual behaviors? And then transactional, again, thinking about power and role relationships and like who's involved in decision making on key points for decision making, right? In terms of addressing social and political and economic issues, and sort of thinking about who has influence and who has position of power and who has influential power, and how do those things sort of play out on the onboarding and recruitment, in supporting students, and working with our broader stakeholders, working with our donors or investors. Like, what do those transactions look like? And are they transparent, or are there backdoor things that people understand to be happening? That there are certain privileges that some people have and others don't. So just really looking at, what value is being exchanged and between whom, and how power plays into that. And so being able to categorize so if you made those kind of sticky notes and you're like, okay, here are my inhibiting factors or my enabling factors for creating a more just ecosystem, you could sort of just create two charts and sort of thinking about structural, attitudinal, transactional causes to that force, and then so that upstream, and then thinking about that force and the downstream effects. And some of you might be familiar with a problem tree, a problem institution analysis. That's why I have these trees on the other side. So thinking about, it's kind of the same thing, it's just a different metaphor. So it's like, hey, I have the stream, upstream and downstream in terms of causes and effects or consequences. Or I have a tree, thinking about roots as being causes, and then I have a core issue, in the trunk, and then consequences or impacts, in the branches. So if you're familiar with that tool, which also I would recommend is another great tool to understand systems, this was a very similar way of breaking it down. And then once you've done something like that, sort of looking at relationships and patterns on these feedback loops. And so here we have, there are 4 different, well, actually there's more than 4, but these are 4 different examples of sort of thinking about, you're sort of mapping, in terms of like positive, like if it's more or less, and sort of what's the relationship between that cycle. And so you're going to take these sort of individually by taking like, okay, what are the factors that you've identified? And again, they might be at different levels, sort of thinking about, causes and effects, different levels of analysis, and then thinking about, all right, what are the cyclical patterns that again keep things in place, or make things worse? So if it's making things worse, it's like a vicious cycle. If it's things are getting better and better, it's sort of reinforcing. It's called a virtuous, cycle. And again, if you go back to the manual, it explains these. It's really clear. And then 2 other ones I think are really helpful in thinking about stabilizing and stagnating is the sort of checks and balances or things that happen. Because there's going to be some status quo that is acceptable, for people who are running the ecosystems. And so if you're thinking about something that's stabilizing, it's going to keep things from getting worse. So let's say your DEI numbers, aren't good, or people are like completely like, hey, this system is not very just, right? So there might be ways of, checks and balances of sort of correcting that, but again, it might be short-lived. And then stagnating, so thinking about why things don't get better and better. So again, there's sort of another, sort of check and balance, with that. So so these are just sort of 4, again, just I'm mostly trying to get you aware of the process of creating the loops and realize that they're different types. Like I said, they're more than this, but it's sort of helpful to then sort of have a category title over each loop, and sort of so that it gives you a little visual understanding of some pretty dense information, but you understand it relationally and as a process and as an interconnected process rather than a particular unit in time. And the other value of this is it gets way beyond individuals and trying to just fix individuals or, train individuals or like change, switch up the people who are, in the system. And then once you do that, you put all these loops into some gigantic systems map, and which is bound to give you a headache at some point because it's going to be really complicated. But the key, I think, is start with these, these steps with each of these sort of practices. Get some clear loops that you feel good about, like you have examples and you really understand it, and then you can start playing around with, again, how all these things fit together. It can be very overwhelming to look at, this whole thing, but it gives you an appreciation of the complexity, and then you can zero in on little areas for intervening. And so the idea is to like start with the pieces and the components, and then you develop your systems map from that. And then you're going to do things like finding your levers of opportunity, so your levers of change, right? So here, it's just kind of broken down. Again, I like this little, plug and play, option of sort of thinking about your systems map. All right, so are there areas of that you could create a more positive dynamic or a more positive loop? Or is there a place where you could weaken or interfere with like a negative dynamic or loop? Or there's a way to shift the dynamic from a positive to a negative, or to create a new one, or to shorten a time delay, or layers of something that are creating interference. And so here's just something that you can, again, once you get the map, you have to sort of think, well, does this give me some insight into areas where I might be able to intervene? And there might be some short-term things that you can do, some things that, and then if you do those things, the sort of theory of change is like, oh, if I do this, then, and I have a reason for it, I see these outcomes, then it's going to have this intermediate effect. And then if that happens and I have those, those impacts, then it's going to have these, second and third order effects after that. So it's just, again, kind of a tool to use to like, pick some areas of focus, map it out, and then develop a strategy around that. And then that can go into like, hey, we're going to have this goal, for 6 months or for this year. And so again, you have that guiding star of thinking about this more just system, but here you've broken it up into thinking about how to operationalize that by really understanding systems and not just thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as numbers of people that you don't have represented in your ecosystem, because we know that even if you did that, and many ecosystems, including my own, are arguably have much improvement to, far to go, let's just say. But even if you're getting some of those numbers, like, you've got to pay attention to, like, what are the dynamics? What are those people doing? So if you have people who are like, okay, you hire some staff or some mentors or something, are they involved, again, in decision making? Are they presenting things? Are they highlighted as somebody who has brokers, resources, and power and opportunity? Or are they putting the name tags out and the food? And are they referred to with not formal positions, like, oh, here's a leader, but they are not given, formal titles or positions with programs? Like, there's a lot of things that are playing out that students are observing and other stakeholders, right? So what's that implicit messaging? So in my own experience, again, as a woman in the ecosystem, I sort of mentioned, set this up as my own participant, my own experience as a participant and an observer, thinking about how I feel in those spaces, and that double consciousness, that I'm very aware as an ecosystem builder. Well, I'm observing and experiencing less than equitable behavior and behaviors, and then incidents. And then I have to make choices, hard choices, like, all right, well, everybody's watching me, so do I play along? Like, at what, which battles, I'm picking and choosing my battles, right? So it's like, if I don't address something publicly, then and I have many of these examples, if you want to get a Zoom coffee or a cocktail, like, when do you step in and say something publicly and privately, and when do you swallow, you swallow your pride or your rage, whatever, but realizing, like, if you don't act or don't say things, or if you get up there in a very peripheral role, like, hey, you weren't involved and you clearly aren't a leader, but like, hey, why don't you bring people back from the break at an event? Like, you're an usher, like, not choosing not to do that, and again, I have many of these examples. It's sort of like, don't put me up there as an example of, like, oh, look how, hey, we have some gender diversity, because that is going to be because everyone sees through that. That's not true. And that it actually is sort of reinforcing, negative stereotypes and things that already happen in ecosystems. So those are, again, just some things to be thinking about as you go. So that's a lot, and I realize I whizzed through, but I'm going to leave it there and see if anything sparked, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lorena if there are any of these questions you want to zero in on the last few minutes. Hopefully people will share some ideas, or if anything sparked in this little whirlwind of thinking about systems tools, please share your ideas and comments.
Valerie, that was a masterclass. Thank you. It was a masterclass. I really feel very honored by, by really understanding those, because most of the times there's a lot of yes, and how do I do this, right? Yes, I believe in it, but then how do I bring it down? And more importantly, all of you, or most of you, who have the responsibility of bringing other people with you in a learning process, whatever that is, right? You have the responsibility to make it digestible, to make it doable, to make sure that they can implement it. So again, thank you so much. If anyone in the room, we still have 6 more minutes. If anyone in the room wants to share the mic, please do so. Any type of comments, reactions, questions, anything that comes to your mind. You guys are humble because you are writing amazing stuff on the chat, but you don't want to grab the microphone, and it's okay. I think that if no one interrupts me, I think I would love to share a comment, Valerie, that I think that, again, you're alluding to it, right, with the process, but sometimes it's very important to just have it in the top of our mind. We do live in, when it comes to DEI, I think that it's very important for us to acknowledge that all of us, wherever we are, whatever our place is, whatever the color of our skin, our gender, we are all part of the same system of advantage, the same system of hierarchy and oppression. It might look bigger, lower, whatever, wherever we are, but we are all benefiting from it and being oppressed by it in so many different ways. And so what we would love to see is that students are not perpetuating. We come to a time where students and academia and the world of education is not perpetuating this concept of not addressing the fact that we are all participants of that system, and not being aware of that system can be probably the biggest mistake of doing good on earth. And so I just want to bring that up again and really encourage us to, how do we make sure that we become very aware of that so that these tools, you know, become even more powerful.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when I started getting more into systems mapping and involving students in that. Partly because I realized, again, a lot of the structural trappings and things that of our entrepreneurship ecosystem were not working, and we're also perpetuating. And you know you can appreciate this, and Ashoka, with your work with Ashoka, is that these Band-Aid solutions, this sort of fixation or bias toward like, hey, we all want to, create our shiny star, or, it's a new flash, everyone wants to be a founder syndrome, regardless of, what's happening historically and contextually within the context and with the stakeholders that we're working with, right? So, and a lot of the models, and again, the things that we're teaching, even though it's helpful to teach, certain skills and approaches and stuff, and trying to get people to be courageous to, start things, there's not that balance. There's not that critical balance of really thinking about our role relationships and execution of power over others as university agents, whether it's, students, faculty, or staff or alums, and thinking about, what can we do, to create a better foundation. So one of the things that I really appreciate about Map the System, and again, that approach is like, it helps people become more grounded. So by design, by like, especially if you're engaging in like the competition, the Map the System competition, you have to spend time immersed. So I come from long experiences of doing community-based learning, community action research, service learning programs, but it's that immersion, so not just having students like, hey, I was, cooked up some idea in my dorm room, or we had a 3-day startup event, all these things, again, I'm part of and stuff, but like, it's like, here's this idea, we don't know anything about it, didn't necessarily impact us, we have no personal experience, but I'm going to found this idea, and it's just sort of going in with, full force with no humility. And so I think that balance of bravado and being courageous and risk-taking that they glorify in entrepreneurship, but having that balance with humility and thinking about managing risk for everybody, and kind of what's a good collective outcome. Those conversations need to happen. So like thinking about Map the System, it sort of forces that immersion and understand the system so that you have a better chance of thinking about, again, levers of change or potential action. Some of those actions could be, collective action or activism, or working for a nonprofit, or doing, lots of different things, working for policy, policy change, running for office, or it could be social venture development. And it's a very good foundation, but I got a lot of criticism, I'll just say, in a very, because it wasn't, they were like, well, that's just, because it wasn't venture development. Like, and I sort of, again, mapped it out, like, this is how I see this fitting in and filling the gaps in our ecosystem, where we have these tendencies and these things that we're actually doing some harm with things that we're promoting. This is a way of creating a stronger foundation, both for students long-term as change agents, but also for thinking about a much stronger foundation for a viable social venture.
Right.
But I got a lot of snarky, I'll just leave it at that. A lot of comments that it was sort of like lesser than, because it wasn't venture development. I'm like, again, and again, that has to do with rewards and metrics and sort of, people want a big number. Like if we have a few teams that are, raise millions of dollars for a software solution, that looks good for the university.
Right.
But it's harder for them to quantify long-term impact and slow investment.
Right.
And those are some of the things that we need to see happen. But for those of you who haven't played around with some of these tools, either with your students and budding change makers and change agents, or using it as tools for yourselves for reflective practice, or trying to unpack experiences that you might be having in unjust systems, I definitely encourage it, because it's very helpful to just, even if it's just to validate experiences and observations, so that so you don't feel like you're just being gaslit all the time. So
we're gonna need another session just on that topic, right? Because I think it's just, that's a big piece of the puzzle. Thank you so much, Valerie. What an honor to share the space with you. Thank you, Michelle, for keeping us on time and organized. And thank you everyone for being here. And sorry for keep pushing you to share, but the things that you shared on the chat are brilliant, and we're definitely going to follow up, right, Michelle? So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.